The cold rain fell in relentless, heavy sheets, turning the city into a blur of gray and neon. I pulled my thin coat tighter, but it was useless. I was already soaked to the skin after the long walk from the bus stop. My bag, heavy with rolled-up drafts and my laptop, felt like an anchor. All I could think about was a hot shower and my bed. I finally reached the familiar, slightly crumbling brick facade of my apartment building and pushed through the heavy front door, dripping onto the worn tile of the lobby. And then I froze. He was there. Mr. Thorne, my landlord, was leaning casually against the frame of my own apartment door, as if he owned the space around it, which, I supposed, he technically did. In his hand was a single, stark white piece of paper. He didn't offer a greeting or express any concern for my drenched and shivering state. His eyes, cold and impersonal, scanned me up and down. He didn't hand me the paper, he lifted it and tapped it, once, twice, against my chest, a gesture so dismissive it stole my breath. "I need you out by the end of the month," he stated, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "My nephew needs the place." He didn't wait for a response, didn't acknowledge the shock that must have been plain on my face. He simply turned on his heel and walked down the hall, his footsteps echoing with finality. I stood there, rooted to the spot, water dripping from my hair and clothes, forming a small puddle on the welcome mat I had bought with my first paycheck. The paper in my hand felt heavy, its meaning seeping into me with a cold dread. I felt as disposable as the paper itself. For a moment, I just stood there, the words not fully computing. 30 days. The end of the month. The rental market was a brutal, competitive nightmare. A deep, cold panic began to uncoil in my stomach. I dropped my bag and hurried down the hall after him, my wet shoes squeaking on the floor. "Mr. Thorne. Please, wait." I called out, my voice trembling. He stopped and turned slowly, a look of mild annoyance on his face. That's no time at all. I've been a good tenant. I've never been late, not once, in 3 years. I was pleading, and I hated the sound of it. He let out a short, dismissive sigh, his eyes scanning my cheap, rain-soaked clothes and my generally disheveled appearance. A slow, ugly smirk spread across his face. It was a look of pure condescension. "Should have managed your finances better," he said, his tone dripping with a mockery that felt like a physical slap. "Maybe get a second job." The words hung in the damp air between us. He knew exactly how hard I worked as a junior architect, the long hours I poured into my drafts. He knew that my rent was his reliable income, paying his mortgage on time, every single month. The insult was deliberate and cruel, and it burned deeper than any chill from the storm. The days that followed were a blur of stressful, futile activity. I spent every evening and weekend scrolling through rental listings, my heart sinking with each exorbitant price and each "no vacancy" sign. I viewed tiny, dark apartments that cost twice what I was paying, and I faced lines of other desperate people at every open house. A crushing weight of despair settled on my shoulders. One night, defeated, I began the miserable task of packing my life into cardboard boxes. The small apartment, once my sanctuary, now felt like a temporary cage. As I was clearing out a high shelf in the bedroom closet, a dusty, forgotten cardboard folder tumbled down, scattering its contents across the floor. With a sigh, I knelt to gather the papers. They were my old architectural designs from university. My competition entries, my late-night dreams rendered in ink and graphite. And there, among them, was my Future City project. It had won the prestigious Sterling Award, a huge honor in academic circles that somehow never translated into real-world opportunity. I sat back on my heels, the frantic pace of the week slowing for a moment. I traced the careful lines of my drawings. The integrated green spaces, the solar-paneled roofs, the community hubs. A tiny, desperate spark flickered to life deep inside me, a small flame of defiance against the overwhelming darkness. What if these weren't just forgotten dreams? What if they were more than portfolio pieces? What if they were an actual, viable plan? That small, defiant spark refused to die. Instead, it grew, fanned by the memory of Mr. Thorne's smirk. It became a determined flame. I decided to fight back, not with anger, but with ambition. I carefully gathered my Sterling Award plaque and my most detailed, polished blueprints. I put on my one good suit and marched into the local branch of the city's largest bank. My heart was pounding as I was ushered into the office of the manager, a stern, unsmiling man named Mr. Albright. I laid out my vision on his desk, my voice passionate, my words tumbling over each other as I explained my future city concept and how it could be a model for sustainable urban living. He listened with an impassive face, his fingers steepled. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then, he let out a short, derisive laugh that made my face flush hot. "Dreamers don't make good investments, kid," he stated flatly, sliding my award plaque back across the vast, polished surface of his desk as if it were a piece of trash. He saw the devastation on my face and added, almost as an afterthought, "Frankly, Arthur Thorne mentioned you might come by with some wild ideas. Told me not to waste my time." The door to conventional financing didn't just close, it was slammed, bolted, and barred in my face. Yet, as I walked out of that bank into the sunlight, the humiliation didn't crush me. It felt like it was being forged in a fire, transforming my resolve into something hard, cold, and unbreakable. I stood on the sidewalk outside the bank, feeling the world spin. I had one last card to play, one person who might still believe in me. With trembling fingers, I scrolled through my contacts and called Professor Evans, my old mentor from my university days. His voice was warm, but mine cracked as I explained the eviction, the impossible search, and the banker's humiliating rejection. He was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "I always thought you gave up on the competitive design world too soon," he finally said, a note of genuine disappointment in his voice. "Your talent was exceptional." We arranged to meet at a small, quiet coffee shop near the campus. The smell of roasted beans was a comforting familiarity. I poured out the whole sorry story, the rain, the eviction notice, Mr. Thorne's sneer, Mr. Albright's laugh, and my future city plans. He listened intently, not interrupting, his sharp, intelligent eyes fixed on mine, absorbing every detail. When I finally fell silent, emotionally drained, he leaned forward across the small wooden table, his expression turning serious and focused. "I know some people," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "In the investment world. Let me make a call." For the first time since that rainy night, I felt a genuine, powerful glimmer of hope, a lifeline thrown into my turbulent sea of despair. Professor Evans's people turned out to be Oakwood Partners, a private equity firm with a reputation for sharp, strategic investments. Their offices were in a stunning downtown skyscraper, all cool glass, polished steel, and silent, efficient movement. I felt incredibly small and out of place in my slightly too old suit. My nerves were a live wire, but I clung to the memory of Mr. Thorne's condescending smirk for strength. I was ushered into a conference room with a breathtaking view of the city. There, I met Ms. Vance, the lead partner, a woman with a calm demeanor and eyes that missed nothing. I presented my future city concept, but this time, I framed it not as a student's fantasy, but as a serious, viable business plan for modern urban renewal. I talked about sustainable, cost-effective materials, integrated green spaces that increased property value, and clean energy systems that lowered long-term overhead. Ms. Vance listened carefully, her expression neutral, occasionally jotting down a note. "Your vision is intellectually compelling," she acknowledged once I finished, her voice even and measured. "The principles are sound. However, you possess no track record. No practical experience managing a project of any scale. Backing you would be a significant risk." My heart began to sink, the old feeling of rejection creeping back in. But then she added, a slight tilt to her head, "Prove this concept on a smaller, manageable scale. Bring us a real, tangible, and financially viable project. A single building, perhaps. Show us it works. Then we will talk." I left the Oakwood Partners Tower with a new, crystal clear, and burning purpose. This was no longer just about finding a new apartment or even about proving my architectural ideas. It was about survival and vindication. And I knew with a sudden, chilling clarity exactly where to start. I became a woman possessed. I spent every spare moment for the next week buried in the public library's records room, surrounded by dusty volumes and glowing computer screens. I dug through city property records, commercial databases, and business filings. My research focused entirely on one man, Arthur Thorne. What I unearthed was shocking. His seemingly solid real estate empire was a fragile house of cards, built on a mountain of debt and risky financial maneuvers. His properties were chronically undermaintained, code violations piled up, and he was clearly bleeding money. Then I found the jackpot. His flagship asset, the very building I had called home, Thorne Manor, had a colossal balloon payment on its primary mortgage due in just 6 months. It was a huge sum, one I suspected he couldn't possibly gather. If he failed to make that payment, the bank would foreclose, and he would lose his crown jewel. I had found my perfect, tangible target. The battlefield was chosen. A meticulous, cold-blooded strategy began to form in my mind, piece by piece, like one of my own architectural drafts. I wouldn't just buy any building to prove my concept. I would orchestrate the purchase of his building. The one from which he had so callously evicted me. I would use the anger and humiliation from that night as my primary fuel, channeling it into pure, focused determination. I scheduled a second meeting with Ms. Vance at Oakwood. This time, I walked in with a new, ruthless proposal. I laid out Thorne Manor's financial vulnerabilities like a surgeon presenting a diagnosis, showing the precise points of failure. I presented spreadsheets, debt schedules, and a timeline of his impending doom. I explained how we could quietly acquire his distressed debt on the secondary market, force him into an inescapable corner, and then use the building itself as the inaugural, live-action test site for my future city principles. My business plan was airtight, detailed, and brutally efficient, outlining every step from acquisition to renovation. Ms. Vance reviewed the documents in silence, her face unreadable. Finally, she looked up, and a slow, approving smile spread across her face. Now this, she declared, tapping the stack of papers decisively, is a track record I can confidently invest in. This is a strategy. With the initial seed funding from Oakwood securely transferred into a new corporate account, I effectively became a ghost in the financial machine. My first official act was to incorporate an anonymous limited liability company. I named it Ethelgard Properties, a name chosen for its strong, old-world sound, one that felt established and untraceable back to a recently evicted junior architect. This name was to be my shield, my corporate disguise. Operating from the shadows with the guidance of Oakwood's legal team, Ethelgard began its silent, systematic campaign. We discreetly approached the various secondary lenders and distressed debt funds that held pieces of Mr. Thorne's sprawling, high-risk loans. Because of his terrible financial health, his debt was being sold cheaply, seen as a liability. We started acquiring these debt fragments, piece by piece, for just pennies on the dollar. It was a slow, patient process, like gathering invisible threads. With every signature on a debt purchase agreement, we were quietly gathering all the strings that controlled his entire operation, and he remained completely oblivious, blissfully unaware of the hands that were now steadily pulling them tight. Several weeks into our quiet campaign, a formal, unsettling letter arrived at my old apartment address, which my friend Maya was still kindly letting me use for mail. It was from Mr. Thorne, addressed to all tenants of Thorne Manor. The language was corporate and vague, talking about potential financial streamlining and exploring all strategic options for the property's future. He was getting nervous. He could feel the walls starting to close in, the financial pressure building, but he didn't know who was building the walls or why. The letter was a clear signal. He was trying to preemptively sell the building, to escape with some cash before his debt avalanche buried him alive. He believed he was playing a clever game of chess with the open market, positioning his king for a safe retreat. He had no clue his opponent was a ghost, that he was already in checkmate, and that I was the one sitting across the board. The active, overt phase of the game was now initiated. Through our lawyers, Ethelgard Properties submitted a formal, written offer to purchase Thorn Manor outright. The number we proposed was a deliberate lowball figure, an amount so insultingly low it was almost a joke, far below its actual market value. Just as I had predicted, his immense arrogance took control. He rejected the offer immediately and with visible contempt, as we knew he would. He fired back a dismissive, almost sneering email to our intermediaries, boasting of other, far superior offers from what he called serious, reputable investors. He was so utterly sure of his own position and power, so convinced of his own business acumen. He failed to realize that this rejection was the precise reaction we had anticipated and engineered. Our low offer was merely the bait, and he had swallowed it whole. We now just had to wait patiently, letting the clock run down. His financial doomsday clock was ticking down relentlessly, and his own pride had become the lock on his inescapable prison cell. The calendar pages turned, and the massive balloon payment on Thorn Manor was now a mere 4 weeks away. The pressure was clearly getting to him. Then, something remarkable happened. The other prospective buyers he was so desperately counting on, the serious investors he had boasted about, suddenly and mysteriously vanished. Their offers were formally withdrawn, one after another, often with terse emails citing unfavorable due diligence findings. My allies at Oakwood Partners had made a few discreet, powerful phone calls to their contacts, subtly suggesting that their internal due diligence on the property had uncovered severe, undisclosed structural problems and legal entanglements. It was a masterful bluff, but in the high-stakes world of real estate, perception was everything. True, raw panic now seized Mr. Thorn. I knew this because I began to hear reports from Maya and other former neighbors. He was showing up at the building at all hours, his suit often rumpled, his face pale and etched with deep worry lines. He was constantly on his phone, his voice rising in strained, frantic conversations that echoed in the lobby. The once confident, swaggering landlord had completely vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered man watching his empire crumble. The financial noose around his neck tightened decisively. Now legally holding the power of a major creditor through the debt we'd acquired, my company began to formally foreclose on several of his smaller, peripheral properties. It was a strategic move. He was under attack from multiple directions simultaneously, and he couldn't mount a coherent defense because he didn't know where the main attack was coming from. It was a death by 1,000 financial cuts. He was bleeding cash from a dozen different wounds, and he couldn't stop the bleeding because he couldn't even identify the source. In a final, public act of desperation, he erected a huge, garish, for sale, sign on the front lawn of Thorn Manor. It was a white flag, a signal of surrender broadcast to the entire neighborhood. Other opportunistic investors, the true vultures of the industry, began to circle the weakening prey, sniffing for a bargain. But their interest was irrelevant, a minor nuisance. We already controlled the entire battlefield. We owned the debt, we controlled the timeline, and we held all the cards. With only one solitary week remaining before his catastrophic balloon payment was due, my company delivered its final, crushing blow. Ethelgard Properties, through our legal representatives, submitted a new, revised offer for Thorn Manor. The number was even lower than the first, insulting offer. It was a brutal, deliberate, and final humiliation, a reflection of his now desperate circumstances. Yet, devastatingly for him, it was the only official offer remaining on the table. The other circling investors, sensing the profound chaos and the powerful, unseen forces at work, had all backed away, unwilling to get involved in such a messy situation. He was utterly out of options, out of time, and out of luck. His choices were grim. He could sign the papers and accept the pittance we were offering, or he would default, and the bank would seize the building, leaving him with absolutely nothing and a ruined credit rating. With a hand that I'm sure trembled with a mixture of rage and despair, he signed the sales agreement, relinquishing his prized possession to the faceless, corporate entity known as Ethelgard Properties. He never saw my face. He never heard my name in the negotiations. He never knew the identity of the person who had so thoroughly conquered him. I sat in the serene, wood-paneled office of a high-end law firm, with Ms. Vance sitting quietly and professionally beside me. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the computer. Together, we watched on a large, flat-screen monitor as the digital deed and title for the property known as Thorn Manor were officially and permanently transferred out of Arthur Thorn's name and into the name of Ethelgard Properties. A simple digital progress bar filled, and it was done. The building, my former home, the very source of my deepest humiliation, now legally belonged to my company. I was then handed a physical document to sign, the final confirmation. I picked up the expensive pen, and with a hand that was perfectly steady, I signed my name, my real name, as the sole owner and principal of Ethelgard Properties. The revenge was now complete, legally binding, and permanently recorded in the city's archives. It was a cold, silent, and perfectly executed victory. There was no cheering, no dramatic music. A profound and quiet calm settled over my spirit, a feeling of rightness. The tempest that had begun with a rainy night eviction was finally over, and I was the one left standing, unscathed, on solid ground. The time for secrecy and shadows had passed. It was the moment for revelation, for stepping into the light. I personally drafted a formal, warm letter addressed to every single tenant in the building, which I had officially and legally renamed Ethelgard Heights. In it, I introduced myself not as a faceless corporation, but as a former resident. I announced an immediate, building-wide rent freeze for the next 3 months, acknowledging the disruption the uncertainty must have caused. I then outlined my exciting, comprehensive renovation plans, a new green roof with seating areas, a shared community vegetable garden in the neglected courtyard, and the installation of modern, energy-efficient windows to lower everyone's utility bills. I promised to listen to their input and to work together to transform our building into a modern, sustainable, and community-focused home. And at the bottom of the letter, I signed my real, full name. The news exploded through the building with the force of a shockwave. My phone began to vibrate incessantly with messages from my former neighbors. Their texts and calls were a mix of utter shock, overwhelming excitement, and profound relief. The mood in the building shifted overnight from one of anxiety to one of jubilant hope. Just 48 hours after the letters were delivered, the storm I had been anticipating finally arrived. Mr. Thorne burst into the building's newly designated management office, his face a mottled, furious purple, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. He must have seen the letter. He saw me sitting calmly behind the main desk, the desk that was now mine, and stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide with a potent mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated rage. You? He spat, his voice shaking with uncontrollable fury, loud enough for the whole floor to hear. This is a joke. This is illegal. You scheming, deceitful little. He was sputtering, choking on his own anger, unable to form a coherent sentence or insult. I remained seated, my posture relaxed. I did not raise my voice. I did not react to his venom. I simply offered a small, calm smile and smoothly slid a copy of the fully executed, legally binding sales contract across the desk toward him. It's all perfectly legal, Arthur, I said, my voice even and quiet, deliberately using his first name to underscore the shift in our power dynamic. The paperwork is all in order. You can see yourself out now. The dismissal was polite, final, and utterly devastating. The full, spectacular story soon broke in the city's leading business journal. The headline was bold and impossible to miss, From Tenant to Tycoon, the architect who outmaneuvered a slumlord. The article was a detailed expose. It chronicled my early promise, my Sterling Award win, the strategic backing from the prestigious Oakwood partners, and it meticulously documented all of Mr. Thorne's catastrophic financial missteps and neglectful management. It portrayed me as a brilliant, patient underdog who used her wits and talent, and him as a greedy, arrogant fool who had finally met his match. The narrative was a perfect, modern-day David and Goliath story. My private, painful humiliation in the rainy hallway was now his very public and spectacular downfall, printed in black and white for all his business associates to see. My inbox flooded with messages from old classmates, former colleagues, and even distant relatives. My victory was now complete, and the entire city knew the story. I was no longer the victim, I was the victor. Roughly a week after the article was published, when the buzz had started to die down, a hesitant, almost timid knock echoed from the door of my new penthouse apartment. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door to find Mr. Thorne standing in the hallway. He was nearly unrecognizable. The expensive, tailored suits that were his trademark were gone, replaced by a wrinkled, off-the-rack shirt that was slightly too large for him. The trademark arrogance, the condescending smirk, had been completely erased from his eyes, replaced by a hollow, pathetic desperation that was painful to see. He looked smaller, older, broken. "Please," he whispered, his voice rough and broken, as if he hadn't used it in days. "A job. Anything. A consulting role. You know my old properties, you know their problems. I have nothing left." The man who had once sneered and told me to get a second job was now standing at my doorstep, in a more luxurious building than he had ever owned, begging me for one. I looked at him, and a clear, vivid memory flashed in my mind, the image of myself, soaking wet, shivering, and utterly defeated, standing in that very same building's hallway just a few months prior. I remembered the sharp, dismissive tap of that eviction notice on my chest. I remembered the heat of my own shame and powerlessness. In that moment, standing in my own doorway, I felt no simmering anger, nor any desire for gloating or revenge. I felt only a quiet, unshakable certainty and a sense of closure. I did not raise my voice. I did not smirk. I simply held his gaze, allowing him to see the absolute calm in my eyes, and said, "I'm not in a position to offer you anything." I paused, allowing the weight of the silence to amplify my next words, throwing his own cruel advice back at him. "You should have managed your finances better." Then, without another word, I slowly and firmly closed the door, the solid wood clicking into place with a sound of finality. I left him standing there, alone in the plush, quiet hallway, swallowed by the crushing, echoing silence of his own once cruel words. The physical transformation of the building began in earnest, a visible symbol of the new era. Crews of skilled, cheerful workers descended upon Ethelgard Heights, but their purpose was to build and beautify, not to tear down or neglect. The dark, dated, and slightly smelly lobby was the first project. It was completely gutted and reborn. We painted the walls in bright, welcoming colors and installed warm, modern lighting that banished the old shadows. We tore out the cracked linoleum and laid down durable, attractive tile. We created a comfortable seating area with sofas and a complimentary coffee and tea bar for all residents, turning it into a social hub. We were implementing the very sustainable, community-oriented ideas from my future city blueprint that so many had dismissed as naive and impractical. The tenants were visibly thrilled and full of praise. They left handwritten thank you notes and small, welcoming gifts at my office door. The building was shedding its grim past. It was no longer just a source of income for a distant landlord, but a thriving, vibrant community and a true home for everyone who lived there, including me. Success, I quickly learned, has a powerful, magnetic momentum of its own. The stunning and highly publicized turnaround of Ethelgard Heights made my company, Ethelgard Properties, a local sensation. Our small office phone rang off the hook. Our inbox was flooded with emails. Other property owners, inspired by the visible results and the positive press, wanted us to manage, revitalize, and even purchase their aging buildings. The city council contacted us, formally requesting our consultation on a major new urban renewal project for the city's historic district. Emboldened by our success and with continued backing from Oakwood, we began strategically acquiring more aging, neglected properties across the city, applying the same successful, humane, and sustainable model. What had begun as a deeply personal, almost obsessive mission for revenge had now organically blossomed into a legitimate and powerful movement for positive change. We were actively, tangibly making the city a better, more beautiful, and more community-focused place to live, one building, one block, at a time. My revenge had built a legacy. Professor Evans, seeing the incredible success and ethical foundation of the company, officially accepted a position on the board of directors for Ethelgard Properties. It was a symbolic and practical vote of confidence. During a lull at our first major board meeting, after the numbers and projections had been discussed, he gently pulled me aside by the large window overlooking the city. He looked at me not with the pity one might reserve for a victim, but with a face filled with immense, genuine pride. "I need you to understand the full scope of what you've accomplished," he said, placing a firm, reassuring hand on my shoulder. His voice was soft but serious. "You didn't just get revenge. That would have been small. You took the rubble, the absolute wreckage he made of your life, and you built something truly magnificent and lasting from it. You didn't just tear down his house, you built a future, not just for yourself, but for all those tenants. You turned his neglect into your nurture." His heartfelt, wise words meant more to me than any newspaper headline or financial profit statement ever could. They framed my journey not as a takedown, but as a creation. One quiet, clear evening, after the day's work was done, I took the elevator up to the newly completed green roof of my old building. Ethelgard Heights now boasted a beautiful, peaceful oasis. There were lush planters filled with herbs and flowers, comfortable benches arranged in conversational clusters, and strings of delicate, twinkling lights overhead that mirrored the stars beginning to appear in the twilight sky. I leaned against the safety railing and looked out at the sprawling city skyline, a vast field of glittering lights against the deep indigo of the evening. I remembered the person I had been when I last lived here, in this very building, a frightened, uncertain, and financially insecure junior architect, feeling completely powerless against the whims of a cruel landlord. I was not that person anymore. The burning, consuming anger was gone, fully extinguished, its energy spent and transformed. It had been refined in a fierce fire, purified into a strong, steady, and unshakable sense of purpose. This building, in every possible sense of the word, was my foundation. It was the proof that I could not only withstand collapse but could build something taller and stronger in its place. A thick, high-quality envelope, bearing the official embossed seal of the city, arrived at my office by special delivery. I opened it carefully to find a formal letter from the mayor himself. It was an invitation for me to chair a new citywide task force on innovative and affordable housing solutions. They wanted my specific blueprint, my proven, hands-on model of community-focused, sustainable renovation, to be studied and applied across the entire city to tackle the very housing crisis I had nearly fallen victim to. The student had not just succeeded, I had become the recognized master, the expert whose opinion was now sought at the highest level. On the wall of my office, in a simple but elegant frame, I had mounted a simple piece of paper. It was the original, slightly crumpled eviction notice from Mr. Thorne, the one he had tapped on my chest in the rain. But to me, it was no longer a reminder of a painful scar or a moment of defeat. It was the first page, the very origin, of the blueprint for my entire new life and career. I had learned a priceless lesson through this ordeal. Justice is not something you passively wait for the world to provide. It isn't something you serve cold. True, lasting, and meaningful justice is something you must design, plan, and build for yourself, with patience, intelligence, and integrity, brick by careful, deliberate brick. And my city was now my next canvas.